South Korea appears to be quietly diversifying its diplomacy beyond Northeast Asia. But this shift is less about new alliances forming overnight and more about a desperate survival strategy against demographic collapse and supply chain fragility. The reality you will hear today challenges the narrative of a clean pivot, revealing how institutional rigidity is currently freezing their ability to act on what should be an urgent economic lifeline. For decades, South Korea's foreign policy operated like a single-threaded mainframe computer system optimized for one specific input model: the binary relationship between Washington and Beijing. This architecture served them well during the high-growth era, when trade with China flowed freely and security guarantees from the United States were absolute. But demographic decline has fundamentally altered the cost structure of that old strategy. As their domestic population shrinks at a rate faster than almost any other nation on Earth, reliance on two volatile neighbors creates a single point of failure that threatens to crash the entire economic engine. The government knows this. They've identified the Global South as the necessary failover zone where high-volume trade can offset low-cost production risks. Yet despite the clarity of this necessity, the execution is stalled by what analysts are calling strategic drift. Here is the thing you need to understand about this situation. While the administration in Seoul has publicly championed a policy they call principled and diversified pragmatism, their actual diplomatic infrastructure remains locked into legacy code from the Yoon era. That previous approach prioritized US-led trilateral security over any form of diplomatic flexibility. The result is a severe incompatibility between what South Korea needs to do economically and how it is currently structured politically. They are trying to run modern software on hardware that was designed for a different operating system entirely. Consider the semiconductor industry, which forms the backbone of their national wealth. For years, supply chains were optimized as if they lived in a monolithic cloud environment centered in Northeast Asia. Now, facing geopolitical tension and potential disruption from North Korean hostility, they are attempting to migrate to what looks like a multi-cloud diplomatic posture. They need redundant failover zones for battery production and chip manufacturing located in Asian nations or the Middle East. These regions are not being courted as primary markets where South Korea can simply sell more goods. They are being treated as critical infrastructure backups that must absorb shock if the Northeast Asian axis fails. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. However, this transition faces a massive architectural debt problem. The diplomatic channels required to manage relationships with non-aligned nations in Africa and Southeast Asia require a level of modularity and adaptability that Seoul currently lacks. Their engagement strategy is still heavily optimized for binary inputs where they can align clearly with American demands or accommodate Chinese sensitivities. When you introduce the heterogeneous, often contradictory demands of dozens of Global South countries into that rigid framework, the system begins to stall. The political will exists in theory, but the institutional mechanisms to execute it are frozen by deep-seated security constraints inherited from previous administrations. This creates a dangerous gap between intent and reality. While Seoul speaks loudly about diversifying trade partners, there is currently no concrete adoption data showing a measurable shift away from the US-China axis that would justify calling this a completed strategy. The transition remains in what can only be described as a state of suspended animation. Beijing has dismissed conciliatory gestures toward other regions as naive attempts to bypass regional security concerns, effectively freezing diplomatic channels with their northern neighbor, while Seoul tries to court new partners who are equally wary of being dragged into the same rivalry they wish to avoid. The stakes here go far beyond simple trade statistics or the signing of a few memorandums of understanding. If South Korea cannot resolve this strategic drift soon, the Global South pivot risks remaining nothing more than rhetorical niceties rather than substantive economic lifelines. The demographic clock is ticking faster than any diplomatic negotiation can move. A shrinking workforce means they simply do not have the luxury of time to wait for bureaucratic inertia to clear out. They need immediate access to alternative markets and supply chains that are resilient enough to sustain their economy when traditional partners become unpredictable or hostile. Let us look at what this looks like in practice without getting lost in abstract theory. The administration is attempting to treat ASEAN nations as part of a distributed network rather than isolated destinations. This means investing heavily in infrastructure projects where South Korean firms build factories for batteries and semiconductors that serve not just local markets, but act as nodes in a larger, diversified supply chain designed to route around potential choke points. But without resolving the underlying security dilemma with North Korea, which remains hostile toward any perceived shift away from total alignment with Washington, these efforts face constant friction. Every step forward on economic diversification is met by increased pressure or instability that forces Seoul back into its traditional defensive posturing. The critical insight here concerns how mid-sized powers navigate risk in a polarized world. Most observers assume the choice is binary. You either align fully with one superpower or lose out completely. But South Korea's situation demonstrates that this assumption no longer holds true for nations facing existential demographic threats. The survival strategy requires abandoning the comfort of dependency on great power rivalry and accepting the messiness of a multipolar environment where success depends on managing dozens of smaller relationships rather than mastering two larger ones. Yet, until they can rewrite their diplomatic operating system to match this new reality, they remain stuck in strategic drift. They are trying to force square pegs into round holes created by decades of Cold War-era thinking. The software stack for modern diplomacy is incompatible with the hardware requirements needed to handle the demands of a fragmented global order. This mismatch means that while the necessity for diversification is clear and urgent, the actual execution remains constrained by legacy frameworks and regional instability. What we are witnessing is not a clean break, but a gradual contested evolution where survival instincts clash with institutional inertia. The window to make this transition effective is narrowing rapidly as demographic pressures mount and geopolitical tensions harden. If South Korea cannot bridge the gap between its economic necessities and its security constraints in the near future, it risks finding itself stranded without the flexibility needed to navigate an increasingly volatile world order. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.